Now we're ready to animate this photo, so let's get it set up. Right now we've still got it as just a bitmap graphic, so the first thing we want to do is convert that into a symbol so that it's ready for a motion tween. I'll press F8. I'll simply call it gargoyle. We'll leave it as a movie clip with a center registration and click OK. Now we're going to be animating this in from the side. It'd be nice to have a little bit of motion inside of our portfolio. We're going to have it sit there for a little while so people can gaze at this picture, and then we're going to fly it off to the other side. So let's just create that simple animation and see how that's going to look. For starters, I already know that I'm going to need a second frame span where the element's static, and then another frame span where we're moving it off the side of the screen. So let's set up all of our frame spans first. I'm just going to move down the timeline a little ways, and I'm going to add another keyframe, F6. That'll give us a second copy of the photo, and this will be the start of our static span. Next, we'll set up the span for the portion where it flies off the screen. I'll just scroll my timeline down a little bit here. We'll space off a little distance. We can always retime this later. I'll press F6 again, and this will signal the start of my fly off span. And finally, we'll want to just remove it from the stage since we won't be needing it anymore. So I'll go down a little ways more, and I'll use F7 to create a blank keyframe, removing it from the stage. Now let's create our first tween span. First of all, it's going to start off the stage, so I'll just drag it off here to the left. I'm going to right-click to create my tween span. You can see Create Motion Tween is right up in here. Feel free to use the Insert menu if you like, or you can also Control-click if you're using a Macintosh with only a one-button mouse. I'll need to set up the end of that tween, so I'm just going to move my timeline down to the end, and we want our photo centered up, so I'm just going to use the Align panel. That's going to be easier. I've already got the two-stage option set, so I'll align it to center horizontal, and we've created our tween. Let's set up the fly out tween next. I'm going to right-click to create a motion tween, move my timeline to the end, and then simply move it off the stage. And there's our tween. Now we can add a lot more detail to our tween, like a little alpha fade or perhaps some blur, maybe even some easing. But before we get into all that, I want to look at just the structure of where we've placed this in our timeline. We can see that takes up about 50 frames of our timeline, and we needed a layer for just that photo. Don't forget, we've got 7 other photos here to put into our portfolio. Now imagine if we had 20 or 50. We're going to end up with quite a mess on our timeline. We're going to need a layer for every single one of those photos, and we're just going to start stretching out this timeline, adding more complexity to it as we go along. So before we get into making a more complex animation, let's see about moving this animation somewhere else. Now I'm just going to get rid of these tweens here. We can move them, but we don't have that much done. So let me right-click on the tween, and I'll just choose Remove. We'll do that for both of our tweens. And let me get rid of all the keyframes except the first one. I'm going to select the second keyframe. I'll Shift-select the last blank one, and I can right-click and clear those keyframes. I'll go back to my photo and center it back up. That's just a line and horizontal center. And then let's take a look at it. Up to this point, we've been using movie clips as a convenient way to group things, and we've been creating them because we have to in order to create a motion tween. But they're much more than that. Now we know how to edit a movie clip, so what I'd like to do now is just double-click on this movie clip here and pretend we're going to edit it. When I double-click, everything else grays out behind it, and I can go back in and edit the movie clip. In fact, what I'm selecting is the bitmap that we placed inside there to start with. But let's take a look up here in the timeline area. You notice we're not seeing the timeline from our main movie. This is actually the timeline for our movie clip. So what we're finding out is that movie clips are actually mini movies. They have their own timeline, they have their own frames and layers, and they're actually a complete movie file. We've just been using frame 1, and that's why we're just getting a static element inside of our movie clip. Now it's perfectly fine to just use this as a group for tweening, but what we're going to do is we're going to package our whole portfolio animation inside of a movie clip just like this. We can use this timeline just like we were using the Scene 1 timeline. But we'll have a nice little package that's just our portfolio and not all the other elements in our movie. So it's going to be a lot cleaner and a lot easier to edit. It'll also be portable because you can actually drag an element out of the library of one movie and into any other movie that you're working on. So this ends up being the much more powerful way to create and store and edit your animations inside of Flash. Now we're not going to use this particular movie clip for our portfolio because I set this one up for our gargoyle bitmap, and we'll still need that because we're going to be motion tweening it. So let's go back to Scene 1 and set up our portfolio movie clip. What I'm going to do is select that gargoyle movie clip that we had before, and we'll choose Convert to Symbol again. I'll press F8. We'll name this one Portfolio Animation. I'll leave all the same settings, movie clip, registration and center, and we'll click OK. Now, what we've just created is a movie clip for our portfolio animation. Inside of that is a movie clip for our gargoyle, and inside of that is our gargoyle bitmap. So we've stacked all these pieces together. Now, let's start creating our animation by double-clicking on this movie clip. There we can see we're inside the portfolio animation one. Now, let's create a quick test animation so we can see how this movie clip timeline is going to work. I'm just going to go up to my keyframe right here. I'll right-click on it, and I'll create a motion tween. Now, we already had our item as a movie clip, and we had it in a layer by itself, so it just created a nice blank tween for me right here. My playhead is sitting right here at the end of the motion tween span, and all we'll have to do to create a little animation is let's drag it right off the stage. And we'll have a little fly-off motion there. Now, we know what that's going to look like. That's just a simple tween. I'll hit the Enter key or the Return key, and that'll activate the playback, and we can see our gargoyle flies right off the edge of the screen. Now let's see what that looks like back in our main Scene 1 timeline. We'll click back here on Scene 1. Now let's just scroll back in our timeline a little bit so we can see my portfolio content layer selected, and I can see a lot of frames here. And it's pretty much on stage from about frame 100-ish to 200. So we've got 100 frames of this. I'll bring my playhead back, and as I scrub it over the top here, you can see my gargoyle picture appears, but it's just sitting there. In fact, if I even hit the Enter key or the Return key to execute the playback, I'm not seeing any motion either. And that's because our play command only plays the timeline that we're currently looking at. Now, I mentioned before that there was a better way to preview our movies, and now it's going to be really important because we want to be able to see both animations, the one inside the portfolio animation movie clip and our main timeline. So let's try out Test Movie. I'm going to go back up to Control here, and I'm going to choose Test Movie this time. Now, this is going to show our movie from the very beginning, so we'll see all the pieces coming in. There's our gargoyle picture, and there we can see the animation. In fact, it's looping several times before my main movie starts over again. Now, let me just close that window, and we can talk about what's happening. A basic fact of Flash and timelines is that all timelines are going to loop naturally. That means my main Scene 1 timeline is going to loop, and we can see that happening in our test movie. But it also means that my movie clip timelines are all going to loop as well. Now, actually, if we have a movie clip that's only 1 frame long, it's sort of looping, but it's really only showing 1 frame, so there's not much going on there. But if we double-click into our movie clip timeline here, we've got about 24, 25 frames of animation, and when it reaches the end, it's just going to loop back and play it again. Completely independent of the main timeline, by the way. Now, our portfolio animation movie clip is sitting on the main timeline for somewhere around 100 frames. And if this movie clip has 25 frames in it, it should actually be able to loop at least 4 times before our main timeline movie ends and then starts looping all over again. Now, in a later lesson, we're going to be learning how to stop this looping behavior. It's not too hard, but for right now, it's actually going to help us. We'll be creating a much more complex animation in here than just a simple animation loop. We'll be creating a whole slideshow. And actually right now, if we have it on the main timeline long enough, it'll simply sit there and loop all day long. so our user can watch the portfolio until they're done with it. And this is going to work to our advantage, as we'll see in later chapters when we start setting up the buttons.